that better?
That is. I see. I'm not even presentable yet. Hold on. I have to be. Now I'm ready to
Oh.
talk science.
Hell yeah. The hat. Oh, sorry. Language.
That's right. There's old ladies and little kids watching this channel. And a very sensitive cat. Although apparently he's busy doing top secret stuff. I don't know. Mr. Rock, welcome to A Bit of Orange. What can we do for you?
Hello, Mr. Orange. Well, I wouldn't say I'm a long-time watcher. I've been watching for a minute. I weirdly enough came from Professor Stick's channel, but no, I enjoy what you do. I enjoy the different points of view, and I can't believe people would come here just to tell you you're wrong like that. But I wanted your opinion on, obviously, exactly how you define evolution, why, and stuff like that. So.
Okay. I can do that for you. If I can figure out how to use Zoom, I even have a slideshow prepared. So I'm ready to rock some science, by which I mean slideshow. So give me a second to pull that up. There's that. All right, where's my share screen button? Oh, there it is.
I will apologize in advance. I am kind of new at this myself, so.
That's all right. Something goes wrong, we'll fix it. All right. Hopefully now you are seeing the tree of life. Yes?
Yep.
No? Yes?
I am.
All right, cool.
It's up there.
So welcome to the Darwinian tree of life. In order to define what evolution is, I find you have to start here because this is the story that Darwinian evolution is intending to tell. So big picture, when people talk about evolution, they're talking about two distinct things that overlap a lot. One is the story of evolution as the history of life on Earth. The other is the mechanisms of what causes the change that the story tells. Now, does that make sense, first of all?
Yes, that makes sense.
Awesome. So the tree here is meant to be the story of life on Earth. So we start off with, first there was nothing, then it explodes, it makes hydrogen. Hydrogen somehow turns into rocks, and then some of those rocks fall together and create the Earth. The Earth cools, and then water shows up, and then the water rains on the rocks for millions of years, turns into soup. The soup figures out how to write DNA and build a cell, and then that cell figures out how to metabolize and reproduce itself. Yay, life. Now Darwinian evolution can begin. So you have bacteria. And if you've ever seen the timeline, it's just bacteria for 3 billion years. It's just, the stuff that you scrub off your teeth when you brush your teeth every night, that's all the Earth had for 75% of our history. Not a whole lot going on there. It's like an unclean bachelor's fridge. It's just nasty. But after a while, they got sick of that, and they were like, you know what we should do? We should make multicellular life. We should get together in groups that are just a unit. So they did that after some committee meetings, but it happened pretty quick. I mean, it happened so fast, they literally call it an explosion. And then they made worms, and then they turned into fish, that turned into lizards, that turned into squirrels, that turned into primates, one of which turned into William Shatner. And so life is beautiful after all. So there is the sort of story, and of course it branches. So the bacteria went to both animals and plants, and the plants diverged into other plants, and some of the mammals became rodents or primates, some of them became wolves. So the story is meant to explain, why is there William Shatner wolves and cabbages at all? Where did they all come from? So it is also meant to be a sort of natural explanation of how these things happened without divine intervention, without intelligent design, with just nature left to nature. Now, so far, is any of that seem like too far out that you need to push back or ask questions about it?
So far it all seems to be good. The only thing that sticks out is just the specifics, but those are just specific names I would just call them, and everything else makes sense so far.
Okay. And for anybody watching who is already in the comment section in all caps, the species that I have chosen to represent the different animal kinds on my picture are not meant to represent what I think evolutionists provide as like the first fish, the first lizard. These are just meant to be something that everyone could look at and go, I know that's a worm. So that's it. So that's one of the complaints I've had. Are like, nobody says that fish evolved from earthworms. I'm like, yeah, I just Googled worm and picked a picture. Like that's not meant to be literally the first worm, but worm is supposed to be one of the first things that was a multicellular life form. And so that goes in the slot. So just to clarify that for everybody. I also don't think William Shatner is the only human to evolve. So again, in case you wanted to nitpick about some of the details, I'm aware of them. All right, so again, every step here represents, we're going through time. So from the distant past at the bottom traveling up and then eventually branching off. So we start off with a planet where there's only bacteria, and then eventually worms evolve. And so now we have a planet where there's only bacteria and worms. There are no fish, lizards, squirrels, or monkeys. And then over time, fish evolve. And now we have bacteria, worms, fish. And so that's how it progresses. And that's one of those things that sometimes it's hard to grasp the big picture. But when you're looking back in time, you are looking at a time on this history wherein there was just worms, that there was nothing with legs, there was nothing really swimming, you know, there was nothing with eyes. That's how the story has to progress, is from the nothing to the everything that is now. Sometimes, you know, it's hard to grasp that minutia. So there you go. I'm a middle school teacher. I have to throw in the details. So this is the story that Darwinian evolution is intending to tell. And the reason why the story is important is because when we look for what are the mechanisms of evolution, we have to find mechanisms that can make this story happen. So if you propose a mechanism of evolution, like say, people will say, well, evolution is just change over time. Anything that biologically, anything that changes is evolving. And I go, okay, so when I get a haircut, I've evolved. And you would have to say, well, no, that's not what evolution is. It's because that's not the kind of change that will turn worms into fish. No matter how many times I get a haircut, or how many times you, I don't know, give a fish a haircut. Okay, the metaphor breaks down at that point. But you're saying what I'm saying is that there are lots of changes that can happen that will not cause any of this to happen. And we have to distinguish between what are changes that could happen and what are the changes that have to happen in order to make this story historically plausible. Like make it possible for worms to turn into fish, fish into lizards, etc. Now again, does all of that make sense before I go on?
Yeah, that makes sense. Would you mind if I ask you something real fast before we continue on, just because
Sure.
It's something that I just kind of thought of. So I'm going to switch sides for just a second here. So I realized something. What makes a different breed of dog different from most dogs than a wolf? And we were looking at, wouldn't wolves have more in common with dogs than the same as other breeds of dogs have with each other? If that makes sense. I can rephrase it if you need me to.
Yeah, I'm not quite understanding the question. Hit it again.
Okay, so you know how dogs have different breeds in it.
Yes.
What makes a wolf so much different than other dogs that they wouldn't just categorize in a different breed of dog?
Well, ultimately, categories are what we group things under. That, I mean, to say that a wolf isn't a dog is just depends on how you use the word dog. Like we generically use the word dog to mean our pets. That a wolf is a wild dog, but we don't call them a dog because they're wild. Like foxes are a type of dog, technically. They're in the, what is the family? Canidae, the canine family.
Yeah.
But we don't call them dogs because we use that term culturally to mean the animals we've domesticated and that live in our houses. But they're the same kind of thing. And that's where, you know, all of our pet dogs came from, is some kind of wild, probably wolf kind that we domesticated and have, you know, chosen certain properties or physical traits and behavioral traits, resulting in things like the Chihuahua and the Poodle, which nature would never create, I propose. But
I hope not.
so in short, it depends on how you want to use the language.
So it's
rule number one: define your terms.
Then.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So you would say the difference between a wolf and dogs is domestication then.
In terms of how we generally use that term, yeah.
Okay,
like genetically, they're kind of the same. I just saw a news article like a couple days ago where somebody had domesticated a fox, and domesticated fox start acting like dogs, that, you know, they even start barking and like develop the behaviors and even sounds of domesticated dogs. So even just within a generation or two, they start to change their behavior. When we start treating them a certain way, they grow up with a norm, having been born into human interaction. So, you know, wolves are not, in the wild, wolves are not around humans. They don't have human interaction, and they have not been artificially bred to have certain behaviors, so that they have to have certain behaviors in the wild that are not necessary in your living room. But like genetically, I don't know what important differences there would be between a wild dog and a domesticated dog, if any at all. I mean, once you get to something like poodle, we've whittled out so many functional genes that a poodle becomes just a genetic nightmare. Like as we bred dogs, we have chosen certain traits that have resulted from the loss of genetic variability. So the wolf population had a lot of genetic variability in it, which is why that wolf tree, the dog tree, can branch into so many branches. But as we choose and we choose and we choose, we are getting generations that have lost the genes that their parent and grandparent populations had, so that when you get to poodle, there's a lot of genetic information just missing that it doesn't have that the wolf did have. So going from wolf to poodle is just a continual loss of information over and over and over until now you have something that's still technically a dog but has so many health problems because it can't do what the wolf population could do. Like certain breeds of dog, they can't regulate their own heat anymore. They can't regulate their own temperature. So they couldn't survive outdoors because they no longer have the genetic information to create these structures and functions their body needs to regulate that temperature. They have to be indoor dogs. So, does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Every now and then I think, I'm just making you drink from the fire hose. As a teacher, that's why I want to make sure that I pause long enough to breathe so that you can ask questions if you need to. Anyway, are we good so far on the frame of where I'm going?
Oh yeah, we're good.
All right, awesome. So let's see. I had a post-it note where I was going. I'm going to start with my definition because, again, most of the definitions you get. Actually, hold on. I got a book right here.
I find when it's best.
Sorry,
I was going to say I find it's also best that when you're having these discussions, it's best that both people agree on a definition or something like that. Otherwise, all you're doing is arguing definitions, and what's the point in that?
Oh, worse than that. You argue for an hour until you realize that you were talking about either two totally different things, or you were in agreement the whole time, but thought you were talking about two different things. I've had those conversations, and that's why I've learned you got to define your terms first. Otherwise, you both just feel stupid and nothing's actually been said. So, so number one is defining, and especially in this conversation, because I have talked to so many people who profess to believe evolution, but have no idea what it actually is. And it's because the definition is constantly just watered down and made just meaningless. For instance, here's a textbook. This is meant to be a middle school science textbook. Evolution, change over time. Now, just for one example, can you name anything in the universe that does not change over time?
The water bear?
No, eventually he does too. Okay. It takes him a while. He's very stubborn. But but like everything in the universe changes over time. Some very quickly, some very, very slowly. But everything in the universe changes over time. So on this definition, evolution is anything that ever happens. Sure, things happen, but it's not really worth writing a book about. And this same series of textbooks, in the glossary of a different book I have, defines evolution as when things change or evolve over time. Like, all right, really? That's the best you can do. Middle school science textbook, and your definition for evolution is when things evolve.
So, yeah, I could definitely see why anyone would have a problem with that. It's a very loose term. It's like saying a color changes when a color changes.
Yeah, you can't use a word to define itself. You haven't defined it. And so I get that all the time. And so most of the definitions that people will throw out for what evolution is fail on some level because it fails to take into account, number one, what is the story evolution is intending to tell, the Darwinian tree of life. And number two, what are the mechanisms that are necessary for that? And so I created a definition that takes both of those into account. And so now I would like to present for you the world's first truly useful definition for Darwinian evolution. Behold, bask in its glory. Are you seeing that?
Yeah, I'm seeing it. Sorry, there was a small thing telling me to pinch something to increase, but I had to wait for that to go.
All right, so let me walk you through this because, again, this is not the definition I have come up with because I am a creationist. If I were an atheist or an agnostic and an evolutionist, I would absolutely accept this definition because I think it makes the most sense and really tells, it specifies what Darwinian evolution is as distinct from what it is not. So let me walk you through it and we'll see if you can find any problems. Evolution is an unguided natural process which increases the genetic information in an organism, creating new genes which did not previously exist. These new genes then cause an increase in physical complexity and associated behavior, both of which increase the organism's ability to survive and pass on these traits to offspring. Ah, isn't that lovely? Like a breath of fresh air, like a spring breeze, like the summer rains. But let's go through it a step at a time so I can explain it. So, first of all, Evolution is an unguided natural process. This is the place where I have to separate what evolution is from what there are people called old earth creationists or evolutionary creationists who go, well, evolution happened, but God directed it. And so it's kind of like a natural series of miracles. And I go, oh, you don't know what natural or miracles are. So that doesn't make any sense. Evolution is meant to be what nature left to nature does. So like erosion. Erosion is not the kind of things where, people come along and alter the rock according to its physical properties. So we have the face of different presidents popping out. Erosion is just what happens to rocks when left outside, right? Those are two very different things. The poodle, like I said before, does not happen in nature because it would not survive. The poodle is what we do when we choose certain features, certain genetic traits, and we eventually whittle down the number of genes that a dog has, so we get something that looks like a cotton ball with an attitude. Apparently that's something people want. So again, evolution is meant to be an unguided natural process. And I have to distinguish this because a lot of times people will go, well, scientists in the lab have been able to blah, blah, blah. And I go, okay, that's great. That tells us about microbiology. It tells us about genetics. It tells us about what intelligent design can do. But what the scientist does in the lab does not prove what nature left to nature will do or what it has done. And that's an important distinction. Because I could point to these rocks and go, well, look, erosion, given enough time and the right probability, would create George Washington. No, it wouldn't. So to distinguish here, the picture on the right, the black and white picture, is what Mount Rushmore looked like before we touched it. That is what erosion does. When nature is left to nature, that's what happens. So what happened when we got to it is artificial changes. Artificial is the term that we use when people are involved, like artificial selection as opposed to natural selection. And that bothers me because I'm like, artificial selection should be when robots are doing it, right? I don't know. Maybe that's just me. I don't watch Star Trek.
That makes sense when I think about it.
Right. If you had a farm run by robots and they were choosing what kind of chickens to breed, that would be artificial selection. That's what and I would love to watch a robot run farm. I'd pay money to see that. Anyway, so step number one is that it's an unguided natural process. Now, again, we need to distinguish what parts of the process we're talking about. Because again, I could point to that tree and say that tree had no human intervention. It was just nature left to nature, growing by itself. And that was happening in the time period where this change happened. So obviously the change from the black and white picture to the color picture on the left is just a natural change. And like, this is the kind of argument you get sometimes. You have to say, no, no, no. What you're pointing at with the arrow is nature left to nature. It's a tree growing. Like, nobody added branches to that artistically to create that tree. It was just growing. But the changes that happened at the same time are a different kind of change. You can't point to one change that's happening in a time period and go, therefore, everything else that happened at the same time is the same kind of change. So we have to distinguish between what different changes are happening simultaneously. So similarly, you could point to, say, some time frame in evolutionary history and say, well, at this point, a whole bunch, let's say the dodos went extinct. The dodos all died out. That was a change, a drastic change in allele frequency. The dodos are all dead. I'm like, okay, that is a change, but that's not an evolutionary change because that won't turn fish into lizards or lizards into mammals. So while it did happen on the timeline, it's not the kind of change that we're looking for. So we have to distinguish between what different mechanisms do and what they don't do. Following along so far?
Yeah, I'm following along so far.
Excellent. Just want to make sure. All right. So in terms of your timeline, you've got a couple of different things that can happen. So we start off with our population of worms. So worms can make the same worms. Worms can make different worms. Worms can all die, or worms can eventually produce something that's not a worm. So again, if you're looking at different biological changes, genetic changes, they're taken to some kind of, future point, some kind of extreme over however many successive generations, they're going to wind up at one of these. Either a long time from now, the worm will lead to just more worms that are the exact same, or like we've done with dogs, we have dogs that are still dogs, but they're different dogs, such that instead of being a wolf, we have the poodle, which is a result of particular genetic changes. But it's not the kind of genetic change that will like make them fly or give them sonar. So we have to look at, what kind of change there is. So this is just the worm population has a certain number of genes that make worm parts and worm features, different alleles. You can shuffle those and shuffle those and shuffle those and sometimes lose them. and get a lot of different phenotypes. And that's what we've done with dogs, with chickens, with the cabbage plant. We've taken the existing genes and shuffled them, sometimes lost them, and it creates a wide variety of phenotypes, but that doesn't create the genes that didn't already exist in the population. So that when you shuffle the worm genes, it doesn't create fish genes, it just shuffles the worm genes that were already there. Now you can lose worm genes, and if you lose enough, eventually the population goes extinct because it takes a certain number of genes to make a functioning organism. And if you lose too many of those, it can't survive, and then they die. And if that becomes, the norm, the population goes away. So in order to go from worm to fish, we have to somehow gain the genetic information that it takes to add fish parts that a worm doesn't have, that a fish does have, that distinguishes those two. Make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So this is where the genetic component comes in, that, we have to think about genes are the piece of DNA that codes for particular structures, functions, and behaviors. And if we're talking about one kind of thing changing into another kind of thing, we have to acknowledge that there are genes that a worm has, and there are genes that a fish have, and those genes code for their structures, functions, and behaviors. And if we're going to go from worm to fish, then whatever distinguishes fish from worm has to be added to the worm population over however long you want to take it. But if you don't add those fish genes to the worm population, all you have is just more worms. Now, does that all make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
I do have the question of, is there any chance for anything in between the fish and the worm to exist between whatever amount of time that there is? Like, let's say, for the sake of argument, we come up with, I know this probably doesn't exist, but at least I hope not. We come up with like an erm or something like that. It's a worm with like weird, like tiny fins or something like that.
Oh, it would be a wish. A wish is a fish. A wish is a worm with fish parts. It's a Disney song in there somewhere.
Is it really?
No, but it should be.
Oh, there is. Yeah.
A wish is a worm with fish parts evolving into a fish. It was the original Snow White, but it didn't go over well with test audiences. It changed into something about a dream your heart makes or whatever. I don't know. It used to be more scientific, and then dwarves and apples, and I don't know. Anyway, so if this story was true, if that's the story that's happening, that somewhere there would have to be, not only, there wouldn't only be one transitional form, there would be a whole lot of transitional forms, as there's a lot of different parts between worm and fish. So you're not looking for just, that one step that's like halfway between, but there's also got to be the step between, halfway between, and where you started from. So for every step up the evolutionary tree, there should be a lot of different varieties, like any animation sequence, essentially. Things that are, a little this, a little that. And again, the fossil record is supposed to be where we find those, and we don't. And we should find just billions of them for every part of the evolutionary story. There should be just a constant series of things transitioning from one kind of distinct, clear kind into another, whether as far as from worm into fish, or from, I guess, lizard into turtle and snake. But like in the fossil record, we find bats. We don't find a partial bat or a half bat or like a quarter bat. Whatever transition had to go through there, it didn't leave any record if it happened, which is one of the arguments against it, is that, well, if it's taking millions of years and fossils happen periodically, there should be something in there. And because this kind of transition has to happen for every step up the evolutionary ladder, that collection of intermediate steps should be for every place on the tree. Every branch that branches should have a collection of intermediate steps. And we really don't find any at all. There's a handful of things people will argue for, but inevitably, if you look into it, you realize that it fails. But if you look at it with evolutionary lenses, to a child with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Anyway, did that answer your question?
Yeah, that answered my question.
Okay. So let me continue along the genetic path here. So evolution is an unguided natural process which increases the genetic information in an organism, creating new genes which did not previously exist. Now, this is where I have to throw in a bunch of amendments, because otherwise people start typing in all caps in the comment section. I am not saying that for every step up the evolutionary ladder from worm to fish, fish to lizard, that the next thing has more DNA nucleotides or more total chromosomes or more total genes. All I'm saying is that a worm does not have the genes it takes to make fish parts. So the cartoon worm I'm working with, I drew eyes on him because it makes him cute, but we would assume that the first worm didn't have eyes. But eventually fish do have eyes and fins and scales and a skeleton and all these different parts. So in order to go from worm to fish, there has to be the gain of whatever genes it takes to make eyes, to make fins, to make gills, to make a swim bladder, all the things that make fish, fish, because worms don't already have those genes. So this is just kind of a common sense approach to, well, if a fish has these structures, whatever few structures you need to say that this is distinctly fish as opposed to worm, the worm doesn't have the genes for those. That's why the worm is a worm and not a fish. So again, not super controversial. It's just if you want to change worm population into fish, you have to add whatever genes are necessary so that it has these structures, functions, and behaviors that distinguish fish from worm. Now again, I will pause for questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I do know that there are certain families of worms that do already live in the water and have some of the parts that are needed to make a fish. What would you say
sure.
for those?
Well, I mean, the premise is the same. The point is not to say that I have decided that worms can't survive in water. I mean, on the evolutionary story, the earliest worms would have survived in water, but the earliest ones wouldn't have had gills. Gills are a fairly complicated structure, and so the earliest multicellular worms would have been just doing gas exchange through whatever skin layer they had, if they had a skin layer. I don't know what the first worms look like, nobody does, but assuming they're just fairly simple flatworm kind of things, they wouldn't have a gas exchange structure. They would just have gas exchange, just like frogs can do gas exchange through their skin because they have very thin skin with blood vessels near the surface. And if you watched Frozen 2, you know that turtles can breathe through their butts, which means that they also can do gas exchange through the thin epidermal layers around their butt, which is a weird place to put it, but hey, I didn't design the turtle. But so gas exchange can be done through the skin. Insects also don't have gills or lungs. They do gas exchange primarily just through openings in their exoskeleton. And so that's what the earliest worm would have. And so even if there's that intermediate step where, worms develop gills and then develop fins so that they can turn into fish, there has to be the increase in genetic information that the first worms didn't have, that next stage of worm did have, so that they can have gills. Because again, either the first generation of worm had the genes to make all of those fish parts, or they didn't. And I would find it absurd to think that the first generation of worms would have all of the genes that would ever come after. So you have to assume that the earliest worm was very simple, something multicellular, but something very simple. And as different structures evolved, the genes that create those structures, functions, and behaviors have to come into being so that genetically it can cause, the genotype can cause the phenotype. So, because the information has to come first, and then it creates the structures and functions that follow. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Awesome.
Thank you for clearing that one up.
I'm here to help. All right, so that's all I mean here is essentially when you go from any particular place on the evolutionary story up to the next branch, or however you want to phrase it, the next stage will have structures, functions, and behaviors that the previous one didn't have. And so the genes that code for that have to be added to the population in order for that change to happen. I have exchanged emails with an evolutionist so stubborn as to, he actually told me that no, fish do have the genes for legs and lungs. They just were modified when they became lizards. I'm like, okay, if you're so dedicated to the evolutionary theory that you've decided, yes, fish had the genes for legs and lungs all the time, those didn't have to be added for fish to turn into lizards, I can't help you at that point, because I'm like, basically you have to just go, bacteria had all the genes that would ever exist, and they just decided to express them slowly. Like, let's just try out the worm genes. We'll keep all the rest for later. Like, they're just doing beta testing. I'm like, no, you have to add genes that weren't there before. That's the only way this story makes any sense.
I mean, the definition that most people who go with the evolution theory even say to themselves, it's the adding of the genes themselves. So it makes no sense to say they're already there. Then no evolution by your definition would be happening.
Yeah, ultimately what I find is that if people feel like they're having an argument, logic kind of goes out the window. They get into debate mode, and it's just, I'm going to prove you wrong no matter how ridiculous I have to be. And at that point, I'm like, oh, I feel like the conversation's over then.
Oh yeah, I get that.
I, it's all I can do is try not to be that person myself. So let's all try to be better, internet. All right. So here's just the evolutionary tree to kind of point out what I'm saying. The bacteria that first evolved, however they got there, did not have the genes it took to make worms or fish or lizards or anything else. They became worms eventually, so they gained the genes it takes to distinguish worm from bacteria, which is quite an enormous leap, but we don't have time for that right now. But so the worms that evolved did not have the genes it takes to make a fish or a lizard or a squirrel or an ape. But eventually they gained the genes to make fish. So every step, again, it's however, whatever process we're talking about, the genes to make it have to go from not existing to existing. So it's just pretty much that simple there. I'm not evoking or rejecting any mechanisms that would make it happen, just acknowledging that that change has to occur if evolution is happening.
Okay.
So what I've done as an example is just make it very, very simple, is just say, all right, well, let's say you've got a worm and you want to turn it into a fish. Let's say that all you need is gills and fins. And each one is just one gene for each of those. So you just take this worm, you add 2 genes, boom, you got a fish. So again, just for the sake of argument, to make it as simple as possible, I'm like, all right, this is what we're talking about. So when you add those genes, those new genes then cause an increase in physical complexity and associated behavior. And it's not just a matter of adding the genes to the worm, but they have to be expressed phenotypically as physical parts and the function to use them. So you've got the genes for fish parts added to the worm genome. Structures result from those genes. Control functions in the brain have to also be added to use those features. And then the behavior to use those structures and functions for survival and reproduction have to be included as well. And this is one of those things, this is why I put associated behaviors, because a lot of people tend to not think at all about the software upgrade that comes at every stage. Because if you could somehow genetically alter a fish so that it grew legs and lungs, and then you put it on land, it would die. Because merely having legs does not mean it knows how to walk or how to breathe with lungs. That there is a software upgrade so that its brain now has to be able to use those functions according to their structure, but also has to be able to use them for their own survival. So the way that a fish behaves, you can't just toss it on land and go, all right, act like a fish, you'll be fine. There's a whole new collection of different behaviors that have to be added to survival on land. So merely having the physical parts isn't good enough, because the way a fish uses fins, if it uses legs like fins, it's not going to get anywhere on land. It's going to die. And so this is one of those things where, again, nobody tends to talk about this. We just assume, well, if the fins eventually get strong enough and long enough where it could support the fish's weight on land, then it turns into a lizard. Like, well, there's also the software upgrade so that its brain can adjust the behavior for supporting its weight on land, which fins don't do. Fins don't need to support the weight of the fish. And even if the fins grew and added bones and muscles so they physically could, you also have to add the behavior so that the fish would, or the fish lizard at that point, would use them in that fashion. Because again, if all you do is add the structure, it doesn't use them in a different way, the way the different structure needs to be used, and it's not a benefit to their survival, it becomes a detriment. So not just physical complexity, but associated behavior. So in the last one, we added genes. Now those genes create new physical structures, but also the behavior to use them for survival benefit and reproduction benefit. All that makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Whenever I see people talk about the different, when it comes to the fish to worm category, a lot of people, when this topic specifically comes up, points out stuff like the mudkip and all that. What would your response to that be?
Well,
mudskip, not
something
mudkip.
like the mudskip or anything like that is, it's designed to live in its environment and behave the way that it behaves. The mudskipper is not a fish that like somebody threw up on land and it sort of figured it out at the last second. That it's designed to do what a mudskipper does. Other fish can't do that. And so if you already have evolutionary lenses to look through, then you can wedge that into your evolutionary sequence there and say, well, it fits this part. But the problem is you can't just take a fish in one step and then toss it on land and have it survive in that sense. That, again, it's got to have the physical ability to survive hopping around from puddle to puddle that way. And it's got to have the software upgrade in its brain that it would intentionally do that. Because again, mud skippers are kind of designed to have that behavior. It's not something where, you know, a normal fish would behave in that way. And so there's, again, multiple stages that have to go from a normal type of, you know, water only fish to the kind of fish that can survive for brief hops across land there. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Sorry, that's one that I find it's weird when that's brought up and when it comes to conversations like this. So I appreciate you clarifying that one.
Sure. You know, I mean, a short version is it's going to depend on the individual you're talking to. Because again, somebody who is only looking through evolutionary lenses will see something like that and go, well, clearly that's an intermediate step between fish and amphibians or something. But I find that's just a result of, number one, having that evolutionary bias, and secondly, oversimplifying it and not considering all the factors that are involved to actually make, you know, that leap from can't survive on land at all to designed to actually survive for brief times between puddles and whatnot. Mudskippers are funny little things too. And you find that kind of thing, that those weird adaptations are in all kinds of animal kinds. But in every one, like if you try to wedge it into an evolutionary story and you keep it sort of superficial, it kind of works on the surface. But when you actually look at what are the adaptations, what are the physical structures and behaviors that are necessary, and not like what stages can you go through, but what are the collections of physical properties and the collections of behaviors that have to all be in place at the same time for that creature to survive with those behaviors or in that environment, it becomes increasingly complex. And you realize, all right, this isn't just one accidental step after another, because there's all these things that have to be in place all at the same time. Otherwise, you know, you give the mud skipper the physical ability to do that, but not the brain that knows how to do it for its own survival, then it just dies like any other fish. If you give it just the software, so it's going to want to behave in that manner, but not the physical ability to do so, it dies like any other fish. So you've got to have these multiple things together at the same time before it's of any survival value. And if you don't have them at the same time and it's not a survival value, natural selection selects it out so that it doesn't get there in the first place. So natural selection actually stops evolution from happening. But we will talk about that in the near future, because I do have slides about that coming up.
Got it.
All right, so this is the point where the genes come into actually changing what you see in a population, both in terms of what it looks like and what it can do and how it behaves. So all of those are important. So finally, both of which increase the organism's ability to survive and pass on these traits to offspring. So we have to distinguish between just genetic changes and evolutionary changes. And for something to be an evolutionary change, it has to be the kind of thing that not only helps the individual that has that helpful mutation, but also has to be able to help it to survive and pass it on to offspring. And there's a whole lot of hypotheticals that could be brought in here, but if you could somehow, let's say you could create a turtle that's like 3 times faster than any other turtle. He gets this lucky, super fast turtle mutation. But because of that, either he sticks out amongst the turtles and it's easier for predators to find him, so he doesn't live long enough. You know, you see this blur of turtle and the hawks come and eat him, so he doesn't have any offspring. Or there's something about that behavior that makes him less appealing to the other female turtles. And so again, maybe it helps him to evade predators and he's faster. And so that helps him personally, but if it doesn't help him to also pass it on to the next generation so that it becomes increasingly part of the population, becoming beneficial to all of the offspring that carry it, then it's a lucky mutation. It might be a beneficial mutation, but it won't be an evolutionary change because it won't affect the population going forward into the following generations. So again, that's just sort of by definition, what evolution has to tell is not, well, what happens if a worm gets a super gene and it becomes super worm? Well, if he doesn't pass that gene on, then nothing. You know, one worm dons a red cape and a big S on his chest and saves the day, but dies a bachelor and has no kids. He doesn't leave behind the population that turns into fish. He gets a comic book and a movie deal, but that's it. That's the end of the story. And we're talking about how do worms turn into fish? So there has to be not only survivability, so they can live long enough to reproduce, because dead things don't reproduce, but also have to be able to reproduce, because things that don't reproduce also don't reproduce. So I think that's a necessary part of any understanding of evolution. So there is my definition, which I think, again, if I were an evolutionist, I think that I would accept this as saying everything that evolution needs to say in a sort of concise way that takes into account not just the Darwinian tree of life, but also our sort of understanding of how genetics has to play a role in all these different phases. Now, I will pause for station identification. Tell me, do you have any questions, any pushback, any of this seem like it doesn't make sense or fail somehow? Anything at all?
So the only thing that, when you first rolled out the definition, the only thing that I had queries about for a moment there was the fact that you specifically add in the increase in the organism's ability to survival. But we both know what direction we're trying to go with it. So for me to nitpick that would be kind of counterproductive.
Okay.
Everything else seems to make perfect sense. If anything, I have to be honest, but this is me more just trying to figure out, because I listen to a lot of creationists. Obviously, I came from Professor Stick and all that, but I wanted to give people like you a fair shake at the idea of evolution not being. So a lot of this was me just trying to listen to what you had to say, if that makes sense.
Sure. So again, the reason why I came up with this, because people so often define evolution so that they're talking about something that is completely incapable of causing the Darwinian tree of life to grow. They like change over time. I'm like, okay, sure, if fish turn into lizards, that's a change, but what kind of change? Like if you're going to say it's a scientific fact that it's even plausible, well, you have to define it better than just change. Like, you know, turning rocks into airplanes is a change, but if if that's the only definition you get, you're not going to wind up with a blueprint, let alone are you going to fly to Orlando. You need to define your terms. Scientific definitions have to be clear enough to distinguish between what they are and what they're not. And frankly, I've never had an evolutionist actually define evolution so that it means anything evolutionary. I did a debate last year where the evolutionist I was talking to defined it to me. Evolution to him is passing alleles from one generation to the next. And I said, that's just reproduction. Reproduction isn't the same thing as evolution. And again, if we're having a debate, that means you think my position is nothing reproduces, which is not my position. Another one, Vice Rhino, he said that evolution is any change in genetics from one generation to the next. And I said, so the fact that you're not an identical clone to your mother means that you evolved from your mother. And he said, yes. And I said, all right, first of all, I refuse to say I evolved from my mother because that sounds weird, but also that's not an evolutionary change. Because again, you would have to show that you have some kind of gene for some structure or function or behavior that your mother did not. Whereas anything we know about genetics says all you are is just a recombination of the genes that already existed in your parents. That's how sexual reproduction works, is you get some genes from the mother, some from the father. It creates perhaps a combination of alleles that didn't exist before. Like when you take a deck of cards, you shuffle a deck of cards, there's 52 cards in the deck, but you can deal out more than 2.5 million 5-card hands. You can play poker with 2.5 million people and deal them each a different hand with only those 52 cards. Okay, you can shuffle for 1 billion years and never make a new card. And the fact that you can make all these varieties and the fact that you can shuffle forever doesn't tell you where the cards came from. If somebody says, well, where did the Queen of Hearts come from? Well, I can shuffle the deck. Okay, well, you've changed the arrangement of cards. Did that make a new one? No, it's just you've shuffled it. So sexual reproduction is essentially shuffling the genes that already existed in the parent population. But you can do that for 1 billion years and not make a new gene. That's not how genes come into being. And so you can't use that to explain where structures, functions, and behaviors come from. I mean, the best you can do is perhaps show a phenotype that didn't exist because of a combination of genes, because sometimes when you combine genes that already exist, you wind up with a phenotype that wasn't expressed in that way because the genes that existed weren't combined in that way. But again, it's not a matter of merely creating a new phenotype, because you can't take worm genes and shuffle them until you get fish. Like, it just doesn't work that way. Like, everything we know about genetics shows that there is genetic distinction between the different kinds. And if you're going to go from one to the other, you have to add genes that weren't there. You can't just shuffle the ones that already were.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Would you mind before we go? Yep, no, it's good. Would you mind before we go on to the next one? I actually have, oh, sorry, it looked like your screen froze for a second. There's 2 bits of, I don't know if I necessarily wouldn't call them evidence, but just queries I kind of want to bring up to you just to see what you have to say. So
sure.
I've seen a study in which there was a human who had grown a small tail.
Oh, sure. I've seen a couple of those.
What would your what would you say on that one? Would you say that would be some form of evolution going on? Would you say that's just freak accident?
Um, if I had to pick a category, it would be freak accident. Ultimately, I mean, there's a
Okay.
handful of those that I've seen. And ultimately, every time that kind of thing is examined, it's not the development of a new structure. It's like, you ever heard of a skin tag?
Yeah.
You know what that is? It's like your skin just decides that it's going to grow an extra chunk of skin. Like sometimes it's due to irritation. Like it'll show up around like where your collar rubs on you a lot. That's basically kind of what it is. It's just, there's like an extra bit of skin and the sort of subdermal fat there that just kind of created a string. But that's it. There's no new muscles, no new tendons, no new control, no nerves running into the brain so that it can be, controlled the way that any tailed animal behaves. So the fact that it's on the lower backside and we can sort of picture it analogous to a tail doesn't mean it actually is a tail. That it's called that because it has a loose affiliation, but the face of the man in the moon isn't really a face. It just looks like that to some people. So it doesn't have any bearing on evolution because, again, look at my definition. If we can see the malfunction of the dermal layer, is that the same thing as gaining new genes that didn't previously exist? Well, no. It's just something malfunctioned somewhere. It's like you get skin tags. Things go wrong. I'm nearsighted. I need to wear glasses. That's not an evolutionary stage because it's not the result of new genetic information that the parent population didn't have. It's that my eyes are slightly malformed and I need to correct that with lenses. So there's a handful of things people point out and they'll be like, well, doesn't this show that this family or this individual is different than normal? Doesn't that show evolution? And that's why we have to go back to what evolution is, and the kind of thing that it has to be is that a loss of some kind of genetic function is not the gaining of a new gene. The misapplication of existing genes or the shuffling of new genes or a disease state, I mean, whatever you want to label it as, if it's not the increase in genetic information that causes new structures, functions, and behaviors, it's not an evolutionary step. So I get why, again, as an evolutionist, if you look through evolutionary lenses, you go, whoa, they developed a tail. I will assume that means that there's an evolutionary stage going on. But if you look at the genes of that individual, they're no less human. They don't have any more genes than anyone else. It just becomes like a skin tag. You grew something that gets snipped off and then you're done with it. You're not a rodent.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's part of the reason why I was kind of skeptical to throw that one into the evolution evidence line, just because, well, as you pointed out, it's questionable at best. And
They're
the
all going to be
second
like
thing I
that.
want,
I've studied a lot. And for the most part, anytime the genes are actually looked at, any of those kind of weird changes come to be that some kind of gene has malfunctioned. Ultimately, it's a disease state. That, it's like being nearsighted. It's like having diabetes. It's not an evolutionary step because it's not an increase in genetic information that leads to new structures, functions, and behaviors. It's the malfunctioning of a gene causing something that was a control feature to lack control. It's like cancer. Cancer produces fast growing cells that are hard to kill. And you think, wow, that's like a superpower, fast growing and hard to kill. Well, no, because it's not supposed to. There's supposed to be regulation to control the growth, but the control has been broken somehow. It's like if your toilet overflows. You don't go, whoa, it's better now because look at all the water it's producing. You go, no, whatever's supposed to keep the water at a certain level has malfunctioned and now it's on the floor. That's not a step toward a better machine. That's something's broken and needs to be fixed. So,
yeah,
I mean, again, important to distinguish between change and disease.
okay. No, that makes sense. The second thing I had to bring up, I don't know if this was real or not. So if it's fake, I give you all permission to make fun of me for it. But
It's fake
um,
news.
no, I saw an article the other day where there is a lizard that it had a mutation where it grown full wings.
Wow,
They
not
weren't
heard that
functioning
one.
wings, but they did have actual wings. Now, again, this could be fake. You know how easy it is to Photoshop just some weird things
Oh,
on an
sure.
animal.
I do that all the time. I know Photoshop. Um, here's the thing that I would say. If you actually find something like a lizard that has grown wings, number one, it would be hard to use that as evidence for evolution because evolution is supposed to be a slow, gradual process over thousands of or millions of years. So to say that in one generation, this thing just popped out wings and go, there, evolution at work, I would be skeptical. But also the way to test this would just say, look at the genes of the previous generations. do they have whatever genes are the cause of this new physical structure? That there's a lot of times where you're going to find that not all genes are expressed. There are eyeless fish that live in caves, and it's believed that those fish who don't have eyes do have the genes to make eyes, but because they've been in caves for many generations, having eyes is not a benefit. It's actually a detriment. That if you produce eyes in a completely dark environment, it's just something that's damageable, that you can, bump into something, get an injury, get an infection. It shortens your lifespan. And so epigenetic changes are when genes are switched on and off due to the environment. That animals and plants have the ability to sort of alter their own genes in terms of turning on and off different features. They go into settings and turn things on and off depending on their environment. And we've learned that what happens to your ancestors 4 generations ago can affect the way that your body behaves now, because in certain situations, it can cause certain, gene switches to be turned on and off, affecting the way that, say, your metabolism might work 3 generations later. So showing that a lizard has wings now might just be that the lizard is now in an environment where that gene switch got flipped back on, and something that it didn't produce for several generations for whatever reason, it's now producing. The genes for it were always there, but not all the genes you have are expressed. Most of the genes you have don't get expressed at all. That's why you have distinct tissues. That if all of your genes were expressed all the time, you wouldn't have bone tissue and muscle tissue. You would just be a blob of cancer, which is really disturbing to think about. But there has to be complete control over what's being expressed, how and when. And so sometimes things like that happen where you get a new feature that you didn't see before, or sometimes it's because of combining genes. Again, in the parent population, you have different genes being expressed in different ways, but when those genes are in the same individual, they get expressed in a way that's not merely a combination of, one and the other. Like if you have a white flower and you breed it with a red flower, you'd sort of expect the result to be a pink flower. Well, sometimes it's, most of them are white and some of them are red, or vice versa. Sometimes it's pink, sometimes it's purple. Like this new color shows up and people go, oh, it's evolution. Well, no, it's just that when those 2 genes are together, the way they're expressed is differently than just the phenotype that's normally there being expressed at the same time. So you got to look into the genes and see what is it that's causing that change. So in short, more information is needed before you can point to that and say, well, that's evolution, because most likely it's not.
Okay, and that's even assuming that it itself is a real thing and not just something somebody smacked together in Photoshop.
Right. Was it breathing fire and following the command of an evil queen?
I wish. It actually did surprisingly look a lot like Toothless.
Oh, well, there you go. Well, then I hope it's real, because that sounds dope.
I know, right? It's the start. Pixar
Make
knew.
a wish. Any other questions on my definition here?
No, that's good. Again, the only thing I had was just the part on the increase of the organism. But again, as I said earlier, we're going in a certain direction. So even if I were to question that, it would make no sense and actually would only harm the discussion at large. So besides that,
Gotcha.
It's good. I like it.
All right. Well, let's then go to the different mechanisms of evolution, and let's talk about the proposed mechanisms of evolution. And now that we understand what evolution needs to be, let's see what of those mechanisms can actually work for it. So again, we're starting off with my hypothetical collection of worms here. What are the different genetic directions they can go? Well, they can go to extinction, they can become different worms, they become the same worm, or something that's not a worm at all. And so these are, the different potential futures for any population or any particular genetic line. So we're looking for, how do we get the kind of change that turns one kind of thing into a different kind of thing? And as we explained in the definition, we need to add the genes that code for the structures, functions, and behaviors of whatever it's going to turn into. So in this case, worm has to be given the genes for fish parts because it doesn't already have the genes for fish parts. And so to be a fish, you need fish parts, which come from fish genes that the worm doesn't have. So yeah, some of this is easy enough for Blue's Clues. So worms have worm genes. Those genes make worm parts. Fish have fish genes. Those genes make fish parts. And I start sounding like Dr. Seuss pretty soon. So again, I'm going to pretend that the only difference between these two is two genes, the gene for fins, the gene for gills. One gene for each, easy peasy. So all you got to do is take your worm population and add those two genes, boom, fish, evolution. Darwin vindicated. So if you have the worm population and you pass on the exact same genes, you get the exact same worms. So clearly that is not going to do it. If you remove genes, eventually you lose genetic information that is needed to keep the worms alive, and they just wind up dead, which again is a change, but not an evolutionary change. So it's change over time, but it's not the kind of change over time that we need to turn them into fish. So if you take your worm population and you shuffle their genes, you might get a variety of different worms, the way that we have with dogs. We've shuffled their genes and occasionally lost them so that we have, again, shuffle, deal, shuffle, deal. You get different hands, which are expressed differently phenotypically. But again, they're still just worms because however often or however many worm genes you've got to shuffle, you only have worm genes. That making new combinations of what you already had doesn't give you what you don't already have. So we are looking to add some genes. So let's look at our mechanisms. These are the ones that I find in most textbooks teaching evolution. They're like, here is evolution. And I've seen in numerous different facets, people will just say, well, genetic drift migration is evolution. Genetic shuffling is evolution. Natural selection is evolution. Changes in allele frequency, all of these are labeled as this is evolution. And I'm going to explain why it's not. So genetic drift migration. Okay, so here's my metaphor. I want $1 million. I have a $10 bill. So let's suppose I take it from the kitchen and I put it in the living room. And then I put it in the bedroom, and then I move it to the bathroom, and then I put it in the garage. How many times will I have to move it before it becomes $1 million? I mean, it's a stupid question. You can't add to what you have merely by moving it. And that's literally what genetic drift migration is. It's just moving from one place to another.
Well,
that's it.
I mean, if you mind, are you allowed to bring something else with you when you do it?
Well, you're only bringing yourself. Like a suitcase?
Well,
I don't understand the question.
Okay, fair enough.
The worm packs his bags.
Your $10 bringing money with it. No, oh damn, I gave it away. No, so if we're allowing the when you take your $10 into another room, if you go into another room, like let's say there's an extra 25 cents that happens to be right there next to your $10, and every single time you change rooms that happens, would that be allowed in this metaphor, or would this not be allowed?
In order to fit it into the metaphor, you would have to say that 25 cents is part of the money I already have. Because what we're talking about is the difference between, the distinction between shuffling what already exists and adding to what already exists. So it's a good question. I appreciate it. But I'm trying to figure out how to answer it so it makes sense. So if I take my worms and I move them from, let's say from Chicago to New Orleans, that's migration. They've moved a significant distance. And it's called genetic drift because they take their genes with them. And in fact, if I have a collection of different worms, some are blue, some are red, some are yellow, if all the blue ones move to New Orleans, then all of the genes for blue have gone with them. So there is a genetic drift, the movement of those genes with the individuals of the population. So when they get down there, maybe they meet some yellow worms and they reproduce and create green ones. Well, there weren't green ones before, but green is just a combination of blue and yellow. And so that in a sense would be like, you know, I take my $10 into the living room and I find a quarter. Now I've got $1.25 or $10.25, but the 25 cents was already there and I already had it. And to go with my worm metaphor, well, the genes for yellow already existed. They were just in a different population. The gene for blue already existed. They're in the population I'm considering immediately. The phenotype for green didn't exist, but the phenotype is the result of two genes that already existed. Just like, well, my $10, I didn't really earn 25 cents because I already had that. It was just in another room. So similarly, if I create a new phenotype by having one population move to where there's genes that they don't already have, that's not the creation of new genes. That introduces to the population perhaps genes that weren't in that population, but it's not the creation of genes that didn't already exist. And so the phenotype that results, the phenotype might be new, but it's the result of two genes that already did exist. And this isn't a mechanism that makes new genes. And it doesn't matter how many times you move them around or shuffle them or have, you know, new phenotypes pop up, because what has to happen is genes that code for structures, functions, and behaviors that worms don't have. Now, does all that make sense?
Yeah, that actually clicked like halfway towards the end of that, where my brain realized that didn't actually make any new money, and it was already. I don't know why it took me that long to realize, but thank you for explaining that one.
No, I'm glad you asked. It was a good question. Again, these are the, I create these metaphors, they make sense to me, but it's not until somebody asks me about them where I go, oh, I didn't explain that part right. So I'm glad you asked. That was good. Anyway, so the short version is, once you understand the necessity for new genes for structures, functions, and behaviors that didn't previously exist to come into being, that genetic drift migration can't do that job, because it doesn't matter where you move a population to or how often or for how long, it doesn't create genes for structures, functions, and behaviors that don't already exist. It might create the opportunity for a new phenotype because of the mixing of genes that couldn't mix before due to separation, but that doesn't result in new genes. It results in a new phenotype, which is not the same thing. And that's an important distinction also.
Makes
We
sense.
good?
Yeah, we're good.
All right. So the next one is genetic shuffling. So again, very, very simple. You've got parent A, parent B, and in order to create the next generation, you shuffle the genes they have, and that produces the next generation. So you can think about that in terms of individuals for sexual reproduction. You can think about it in terms of populations, like with our blue worms moving to New Orleans and meeting the yellow worms. But shuffling is exactly as it sounds, that it's shuffling. It's taking what was already there and creating a new combination of those things, but it's not a creation of new things. So metaphorically, you take a deck of cards, you shuffle it. Well, if you take a second deck of cards and you shuffle them together, well, now you have 104 cards together. But do you have the Archduke of Hearts? Well, no, because that card didn't exist in either deck. You'll have two Queen of Hearts, but you're not going to get the Archduke of Hearts because you can't shuffle two collections of cards to make a new card. That's a different process. And similarly with genes, you can't shuffle existing collections of genes to make a new gene. The only thing that results is potentially a new combination that wasn't in the population before, which can result in a new phenotype. So again, if you're just looking superficially, you go, oh, this lizard has wings. But does it have genes that didn't exist in the parent population? Or is that just the phenotype that results when you mix, gene A with gene B, and you just haven't seen that before? Or at least haven't seen it in many generations. Maybe that used to be normal, but that kind of genetic shuffling hasn't happened for a while, but now it's happened again. And we're like, oh, it's a new species. Well, no, it's just it's a combination of the genes the population already had. We just haven't seen that combination in a while. Because again, you got recessive genes that in a lot of populations, there are certain traits that are very rare, but that's not the addition of genes. It's just that some traits are dominant, some are recessive. And so there's some that you might not see for generations. Like you can carry genes you don't express. I have the gene for blue eyes. And I know that because I have a daughter with blue eyes. I have brown eyes, but brown is dominant. And the way that it works is I have the expressed phenotype of brown eyes. And I wouldn't have known I had the gene for blue eyes if I didn't have a daughter, because you don't see blue in my eyes. But because my daughter has blue eyes, I know that I must carry that gene because she has blue eyes. So similarly, that could go on for several generations. My mother has blue eyes. So if you just looked at her and looked at me, you would say, well, you don't have the gene for blue eyes in your family. But then you look at my daughter and you go, oh, you have to carry it because it's recessive, which means she got the gene for blue from both her mother and me, which shows that the gene for blue was in my family. It was in me, but it didn't show up for a couple of generations, which might be what your winged lizard is showing, is that recessive gene just pops up after a couple of generations because you have the right chance of a combination of genes that result in that phenotype, which is different than new genes. It's just that combination that hasn't been seen in a while. So there you go. Yeah. Now, does that all make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. For some reason, when you said that, though, I pictured a redhead just randomly showing up in a family. I don't know why that came up.
It does happen. Again, there's, well, I mean, the thing is we tend to think about genes in a fairly simple, grade school sense, but every now and then you not only can find what we refer to as black parents having a white baby or white parents having a black baby, but you can find examples of twins being born where one is black and one is white, in the sense that one is very dark skinned, one's very light skinned. And, if you know anything about twins, it's not, well, there's two different fathers. That's, two identical, well, semi-identical, genetically very similar from the same father, but because the genes just got shuffled in a particular way, it was expressed very differently in two children born at the same time with the two same parents. I mean, there's, if you just Google it, you can find a handful of examples of that. It's like two girls born at the same time, they're twins. But if you looked at them without knowing their parentage, you'd say, well, this is a black child and that's a white child. But, you know, which further goes to show just how kind of meaningless those terms are. It's like, well, you know, if both your parents are white, but you're black, are you still black or are you white? Because like, you're human. We all have the genes for brown, but there's like 50 different genes involved in creating your particular skin density phenotype. And so the grid of those genes interworking together is like strangely complicated to what we would think. But because of that, like if it gets shuffled in the right way, you know, a child is born that looks different enough from their parents where you're like, I didn't see that coming. Well, it's not evolution. It's not new genes that didn't exist. It's just that when you shuffle them a certain way, when certain genes are switched on and off, it results in a phenotype that you might not expect. But again, that's not the same thing as making new genes that weren't there in the parent population. And we're all the children of God. So we're all one race. That's important. It doesn't really, it's not our topic, but I thought I'd throw it in there.
Oh, no, I appreciate that you did.
All right, so next is natural selection. Now, you're probably familiar with natural selection because Chuck D included it in the title of his book. So the title is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And while I don't want to put words in his mouth, I feel like what his title meant to Chuck was that natural selection is the means by which species originate. But again, maybe I'm just interpreting that. So it just...
I mean, that's all we can do with a dead person.
Well, you can dig them up and turn them into soup, but I wouldn't recommend it. So the title, again, so I've had lots of people say, well, natural selection is evolution. Like that's their definition. I say, how do you define evolution? Natural selection is evolution. Okay, let's talk about what it is. In any population, there is a variation of some kind. So due to a diversity of genes in the population, there is a diverse expression of phenotype. In this case, I'm just simplifying to they're different colors. You got a blue worm, an orange one, a pink one, a yellow one, and a green one. So they're all basically the same worm. They're in the same population, but they were expressing different phenotypes because there is a variety of genes in the population. So because of that variation, something in the environment makes it easier for some to survive than others. So this is what we call environmental stressors. Something in the environment makes it easier for one variation to survive than others and vice versa. So it can be predators, it can be disease, it can be a change in temperature, availability of food or water, whatever it is, some slight difference between them makes it easier for one variety to survive when others don't. So here I've got crabs and the crabs are all like, oh, I want to eat the orange one and the pink one. And they eat all of those and then all of those are gone. And they're like, I'm still hungry. So they eat these two and that leaves just the blue one. So we would say in this situation that the blue one is the fittest. Because the concept of survival of the fittest is that your variation makes you more fit to survive that environmental niche than other variations. So it's, and again, a lot of people don't fully understand that fittest does not mean stronger or smarter or faster or anything like that. It merely means that you survive when the others are dead. So this might have been the dumbest worm among them, but because the predators were not looking for blue worms, they were looking for, you know, the warmer colors for whatever reason. Maybe they were colorblind, I don't know. But for whatever reason, this one survives. So the only thing we can really say in terms of fitness is whatever that one trait is that helps you survive, this is the part of the population that has it. Therefore, he is the fittest. So people, and that's natural selection. The others were selected out. This one was selected to be the fittest. And that in its entirety is basically what natural selection is. Now, does that make sense so far?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So again, you hear about this a lot. Sometimes people use the term adaptation, that this worm had a beneficial adaptation. All that means is it had a particular trait that is involved in the fact that it survived when the others didn't. That it's a factor that made it more likely to survive and pass on its genes to offspring than the others. So in this environment, the blue one, being the fittest, becomes the dominant phenotype. That because the gene for blue is in the blue worm, he passes that on to his offspring, and they pass that on to theirs. So what was a diverse population of blue and pink and yellow and green now is just primarily a population of blue worms, because the others were selected out by nature. They were naturally selected out, and he was naturally selected by nature to be fit, meaning that he was the fittest. This is survival of the fittest. So those terms kind of get, they're sort of interchangeable in the sense that, and it's also metaphorical in the sense that nature doesn't actually make the conscious choice of picking one. So when we say nature selects, it's a metaphor, and I think we all understand that. But natural selection can't be evolution because it's doing the exact opposite job of what evolution needs to do. Consider this. Well, let's see where I go. I'll get to that in a second. We used to have the genes for blue and the gene for orange, the gene for pink, the gene for yellow, the gene for green. That's 5 different alleles for different phenotypes. Now we have one of those. We have lost 4 of the 5 genes for color. You can't make new genes that don't exist by getting rid of the genes that already exist. Natural selection is purely subtractive. It gets rid of existing features. It gets rid of the genes for those features, given enough time. The only thing it can do is result in the loss of genes. So if you need to add 2 genes to the worm population to turn them into fish, natural selection can't do it because the only thing natural selection can do is remove existing worm genes. You can't add by subtracting, therefore natural selection cannot be an evolutionary mechanism. It can happen, it can be a biological change, it can be a genetic change, but it cannot be an evolutionary change because you can't add by subtracting. And the fun thing about this is if you go to the 6th edition of Charles Darwin's book, he actually acknowledges this at the beginning of chapter 4. He goes into detail for like half a page. He's like, now when I say natural selection, obviously I'm using a metaphor. I don't think nature selects. And also, and he clarifies that natural selection, people have said that natural selection is meant to induce variability in a population, meaning meant to create new variations in a population. Whereas it's only meant to essentially show that certain variations are helpful to survival and others are detrimental and some don't make any difference. So he explains that natural selection only removes existing variations. It cannot produce any new variations that don't already exist. It just took him 5 editions before he acknowledged that. But I like the fact that in his own book, he's like, yeah, the title, I didn't really mean that. Good old Chuck. You gotta love him. You don't, but whatever, he's dead.
I am going to have to check out these books, though, because that is not something, obviously, when you're talking to certain people who want to push a certain idea, they're not going to let you know the flaws and all that. So I'm definitely going to have to try and find a copy of these books to read, because I didn't know it said that. No one's ever told me.
Right. Well, there are 6 editions of Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, the Preservation of Preferred Races, and the Struggle for Life. Before he died, his last edition was the 6th edition. And the 6th one is the one that most clearly states it. But I'll be honest, his whole book is a terrible read. He was not a good author. He was much better at drawing, except when he drew that tree of life that looked like an alien giraffe. I don't know what that was about. Or maybe I'm thinking of someone else with the drawings. I am thinking of someone else with the drawings. He was a terrible everything. And the thing is, if I can go off on a slight tangent, what Darwin actually showed in that book is not the creation of one kind of thing from another kind of thing. What he traces in there and what he attempts to show is like why we have varieties of chickens instead of just one chicken, or how one particular variety can give rise to distinct ones. I mean, the reason why, one of the things he did for this, he couldn't go out and collect his own samples because in his later life he was ill. We don't exactly know what was wrong with him, but he spent a lot of time throwing up. And so he was at home and isolated a lot. But he had another scientist who was traveling and would send him specimens. And so one of the things he found was like, if you go to island A, you find a particular duck. You go to island B, you find a very similar duck, but it's a little different. And then you go to island C, and there's a even slightly different duck, where you kind of can follow the progression of duck A, changed a little here, changed a little there. And he's like, well, you know, that kind of little bit of change from one to the next because of natural selection, he tried to explain the mechanism of why what's essentially one kind of duck has this variety in different places. And so the book Origin of Species doesn't really attempt to explain how worms turn into fish. That was just extrapolated later, but it's just a matter of, well, how come different populations of duck look a little different? Well, it's because of these means. So you have, I mean, again, you start off with a diverse population. And if you go from point A to point B, there's different environmental stressors. So in this example, the blue one survives. Well, maybe on the next island, the yellow one survives. Maybe on the next island, the orange one survives. So you have different parts being weeded out by nature But again, natural selection is selecting out, it's not adding to. So that what Darwin was showing in his book is kind of just how nature produces these variations, but it doesn't show how they create them from not existing. It shows how they take a diverse population and whittle it down to a less diverse population that's a little different than a different, less diverse population. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So it was extrapolated later to go, well, if ducks can turn into ducks, then maybe worms can turn into fish. And therein is the distinction that I'm going to make. But we'll talk about that in detail in a bit. I'm going to go through the next two here. The next one here just follows real simply from the last one. You know what alleles are, right? It's a variation on a gene. Well, for people watching at home, we're not live right now, but I'm going to put this up on my website because I don't have time to make other content. So this is good for me. An allele is a variation on a gene. So all of these worms have a gene for color, but they have a variation on the gene. And so the word allele just means a variation on a gene. So in the first generation, the blue allele is in 1/5 of the population. You got 20% of the worms carrying that allele for blue. All right, that's generation 1. Generation 2, after those crabs combine, eat everybody else, the allele for blue is now 100% of the population. So that is a change in allele frequency. The frequency with which that allele is found and expressed has gone from 20% to 100%. So very clearly a change in allele frequency. But the problem is that allele was already there to start with. In order to show how a worm can turn into a fish, you can't say, well, in generation 1, there's the gene for blue, and in generation 2, there's still the gene for blue. Doesn't that make it more fish-like? Well, no, it hasn't changed at all. And I've had a lot of people, there are textbooks that will say evolution is changes in allele frequency. Like, changes in allele frequency are not biological changes. They are not genetic changes. They are statistical changes. This is census information. That we already had the gene for blue, we still have the gene for blue. So if you're looking at genetics, nothing has changed. If you're looking at statistics, the number of them that have blue, the number of individual worms that carry that blue and express it, that changed. But what's changed is the math, the census information. It's not the genes. And in order to make a worm turn into a fish, you need to add the genes for fish parts. Merely keeping the gene for blue doesn't do that. You can't add by not adding. So,
well, I mean, you can, but you have to get into the negatives. Sorry about that. I don't mean to keep over talking you.
So, do you have any questions on that before I carry on?
Oh, no. Actually, it all makes sense because besides that stupid little comment there, again, sorry for interrupting you. Yeah, a lot of the ones so far, it's the mutation I'm mostly interested in, but a lot of all the ones above don't describe how something could change. It's just how certain things can rearrange and all that. And which, I mean, all good and done. Most people don't really argue against that. But you can't, as you said before, you can't really get a fish by just changing the color of skin or something like that, by just swapping, which just happens to show up between those things.
Right. Again, it's important to remember the relationship between genotype and phenotype, that a particular existing combination of genes, or I'm sorry, a new combination of already existing genes, I should say, could result in a phenotype we haven't seen before. But that's not the same thing as adding new genetic information. If we're only looking superficially at the physical appearance, the phenotype, then we might artificially assume that that means a new gene, but every time we look into it, we find, oh, this is just the combination of this gene with that gene, or the repression of this gene that's usually functioning, but now the other gene is doing everything. And that in order for evolution to happen, you have to have the addition of genetic information so that it can cause new structures, functions, and behaviors. But every time we look at all these different mechanisms, either they don't do anything at all, or they remove genetic variability, which is the exact opposite. So the reason why I've got this list here is first of all, because these are always proposed as mechanisms of evolutionary change, whereas I would say these might be genetic changes or biological changes or environmental changes, but they are not evolutionary because they don't do what evolution needs to do, which is why defining our terms is so important. If you just go, well, it's change over time, well, sure, the poodle is an example of that, but the poodle is a genetic nightmare that can barely survive on its own. It's not an evolutionary step, and it doesn't result from the creation of new genes. It's not the kind of change that turns worm into fish or fish into lizards. So all of these are put in textbooks as evidence or examples of evolutionary change or as mechanisms of evolution. And the point I want to make by showing this is that they don't do the job that evolution needs to do. And that's why they've had to water down the definition. In order to use any of these as mechanisms of evolution, you have to water down the definition so that it's just change over time. Well, look, if you're just trying to show that things change, sure, all of these are changes, but that's not the kind of change we're looking for. We're looking for a distinct kind of change that will turn worms into fish. Turning worms into the same worm, like we just showed with changes in allele frequency, our blue worms stayed blue worms. That's not even a change. You're like, oh, but the numbers of them, okay, the math changed, but the worms didn't. So that's not evolution. It's just math. I like math, but it's not the same thing. So, so mutations become like the holy grail of evolution and the last hope for making all this happen. And of course, if you read comic books and seen movies, you know that mutations can do anything. And so that's where we're going to look next. Now, do you have any questions or comments before we move on?
I have a comment, but it's not really, just to clarify, and I'm pretty sure you mean this as well. When we're talking about, obviously, we're not looking for specifically just a worm turning into a fish. We're just talking about any one thing turning into another thing. The worm and the fish are just representations for that idea, right?
Right. I'm just using this as one particular example. I mean, it could be ape to man. It could be, rodent to wolf. I mean, wherever it is, it's just, this is just the one I kind of latched onto because I thought this would be a real easy one for people to see. Sometimes I go with fish to lizard because, again, certain types of physiological changes and behavioral changes are much easier to identify between certain kinds than others. Whereas if I go for like, the rodent to canine evolution, there's a lot more overlap in terms of sort of how we view them. They're both fuzzy, warm-blooded creatures with 4 legs. And we're like, oh, that's kind of the same thing. Whereas if you go worm to fish, you're like, all right, I can see that worms and fish are very different. And fish to lizard, those are also very, very different. And so it's easier for everybody to see the distinction between them. But this applies to any change of kind anywhere up the evolutionary tree. So yeah.
Okay, sorry, I just felt it best to clarify that way. Neither you or me get anyone saying, oh, you're just picking this one just because it's the silliest,
Oh, I got you. But again, this is what the evolutionary story is telling, is that at one point there was just worms and bacteria, and then the worms gradually evolved into fish. And I'm just saying, okay, if that's the story that this is meant to tell, how could that happen? What is the possible kinds of changes that could make that happen? And none of these can make that happen. But again, that could be anywhere on the tree. It's just easier.
I'm caught up so far.
All right, so let's talk mutations here. This is real easy. You just take some worm genes and you turn them into fish genes. All right, well, I guess it's possible. Maybe I've been wrong all this time. So do mutations work? Yes, absolutely. But actually, no. So this is where I'm going to get into. I'm going to just sort of go through what mutations are fairly quickly, because again, you could fill a whole semester with information about this. A mutation is change in DNA, the hereditary material of life. An organism's DNA affects how it looks, how it behaves, and its physiology, all aspects of its life. Now, this is from evolution.berkeley.edu, the Evolution 101 website, brought to you by the Understanding Evolution team. Their name is not only the Understanding Evolution team, but it has an exclamation point at the end, which I appreciate. And I also appreciate the fact that they acknowledge here that the DNA affects not only how it looks, but how it behaves. So they kind of acknowledge that there's that whole behavioral aspect, that there's the software with the hardware, but it's like the only time on this website where they ever acknowledge that. And then they just kind of go, well, we'll just assume that when fish grow legs, they also learn how to use them. Like, oh, okay, we're just going to, sure, we'll just assume that, take it on faith. So one of the things that's necessary for understanding how mutations work is the size of the information involved, both in terms of how much is there, but also how little needs to change in order to change what it does. So I just got a couple of examples here. The average gene size in humans is 10 to 15,000 base pairs. So it's like, all right, you want to call up the pizza joint and order a pizza. Imagine if the phone number is 10,000 digits long and you have to get it right the first time. And that's the average size. There are smaller ones, but there's also bigger ones. And that's why I included the DMD gene. 2.3 million base pairs. That's one gene coding for one thing, that one protein, which I could be wrong about this, but I think that's one of the genes that holds together muscles and makes them elastic. But I would have to look into that because it's been a while since I made this slide. So the point is that we have a gene that's 2.5 million base pairs long. And again, that has to all be the right information, like dialing a phone number. Imagine having a 2 million digit phone number. You want to get through, you got to get that right. You have to get all of it right. So how much change needs to happen in order to cause disease or death? Well, we've got, the average gene in humans is 10 to 15,000 base pairs. So they're not all as big as 2.5 million. The average is around 10 to 15,000. So how much changes in that, how many digits do you have to dial wrong in your 10,000 digit phone number in order to cause actual disease or death? And it can be as little as one nucleotide change. And there are many, many examples of this. The example on the picture on the right-hand side, the whole right-hand side is from the Human Genome Project. If you go to the Human Genome Project website, there's this great collection where they show you all 23 chromosomes, and they kind of show you what they do. And when I first saw this list, I thought, oh, it's just a list of what these different genes do. What that list actually is, the majority of it for all of these chromosomes, is a list of the diseases that are caused by mutations. If you go through there, you find words like disease or cancer or symptom. So sometimes in this long list, you'll find, like there you go, hair color brown. Okay, so there, just hair color brown. But then, you read through sensitivity, deficiency, this is a disease, that's a disorder. It's just a long list of, when we've studied these genes, we find that mutations in all of these have caused this laundry list of diseases. And that's if you survive. Like, if necessary genes are broken, you don't live long enough to be born. The development of you in your mother's womb fails at some point and you're a miscarriage. So this is just the genes that are broken enough to cause disease, but not so broken that it keeps you from being born in the first place. And again, some of these are a change of a single nucleotide, one DNA letter in the 10,000 digit number you're trying to dial. And again, you find this with all of them, that everything we've studied for genes, you've got chromosome 1, 246 million base pairs. You change one of those letters, some disease shows up potentially, And so it's not just information, but it's specified information that has to be what it is. And there's not there is in the languages, this is the great thing about the design of it. In the language of DNA, there is wiggle room for potentially neutral changes. So it's possible for a particular codon, a 3-letter word that codes for an amino acid that gets put into part of a protein, it's possible for one of those to get changed without causing a different protein. So there's that built into the language. Also, we have Picobots, these tiny little machines in all of our cells, and all life has these things that go around double checking the DNA to correct spelling mistakes. So that when a mutation happens, you have structures and little machines in every living cell that goes and finds those and corrects them. And so, which, again, should just blow your mind that you have spell check in your DNA. Every one of your cells has a machine whose job it is to spell check your DNA so mutations don't happen. But when those miss it, or when they can't work, the change of a single letter can cause a disease or a malfunction, which just shows you got to dial the whole number right if you want to get your pizza. And this is supposed to be, this is supposed to be the sort of great hope of evolution, is just accidental blind random changes, that's going to add up to beneficial mutations, and not just beneficial mutations, but changes in structure, function, and behavior such that somehow worm gets the gene it takes to make eyeballs and skeleton and gills and whatever else that the fish has that the worm didn't have. So in a very strict literal sense, beneficial mutations of this sense are not impossible, but in a strict literal sense, it's not impossible to flip a coin heads up 1,000 times in a row. But statistical probability makes mathematically things that are not technically impossible, mathematically impossible. Because for any improbability, there's a list of other things that are far more likely to happen. So again, you can flip a coin heads up 1,000 times in a row. There's no reason that's impossible, but you never will, because there's so many other probabilities of how it's going to happen if you flip it 1,000 times in a row. So similarly with DNA mutations here, because a single change, a single letter out of 10,000 being changed can cause disease and potentially death, the odds of that kind of change adding up beneficially over long periods of time drops every time it happens. And so even if you get that one lucky beneficial mutation, the next one will probably kill you. And so you lose the benefit of what you had. You know,
Okay.
so it's just a matter of actual probability. The odds of these things taking even neutral mutations and adding up to beneficial ones, the odds of it happening drops with every generation and drops with every mutation. So the sort of magical pie in the sky hope that the mutations will add up into new genetic information is the least likely outcome, and so unlikely that you're statistically more likely to win the lottery every day for 4 years and get struck by lightning once a week. So while you want to, like, some people will try to argue, well, it's possible. Well, it's also possible to flip a coin heads up 1,000 times in a row. But if I told you that I've done that, you wouldn't believe me, and you shouldn't. So I'm saying that while mutations are the only hope for evolution to happen, everything we know about genetics, everything we've ever learned studying the genetics of any species, including and especially our own, says that it is impossible. That mutating worm is far more likely to kill worm than to create fish parts, such that you're far more likely to flip a coin heads up 1,000 times in a row every day for the next year. So is it impossible? Technically, no, but yes, it is. It's impossible. So, so therein is sort of the short version. And again, like, let me specify one thing is people will say, well, there are beneficial mutations. Sure. We can see this change in the genes of, let's say, a bacteria. There's gene duplication. Well, instead of making one of these genes, it accidentally made two. And there's this beneficial result of it. Like, okay, now it has two of a gene it already had. So it doesn't have the gene for a structure, function, or behavior it didn't have. Now it has two. But because of the complexity of genetic information, it has a phenotype it didn't have before. Well, that's a benefit, but that kind of change continually, what we constantly see is that kind of change winds up with things that we label as being a disease state, that it no longer can do what it used to do, that it has some kind of malfunction. Similarly, antibiotic resistance bacteria. People go, well, look, they're evolving to resist antibiotics. No, first of all, the antibiotic resistant strains are always there. They've always been there. They were there 200 years before we had antibiotics. And we've proven that by finding bacterial strains that have been frozen in sailors 200 years ago. There were some dudes who went to like the South Pole and some of them died on the expedition. Well, when we found their frozen bodies, we found that they had in their digestive tract and on them bacteria that were resistant to antibiotics. But this was, 150 years before we even tried to make antibiotics. So those strains are always there. And if you check the CDC website and you ask them, well, where do these strains come from? They show you, well, in any population of bacteria, some of them will be resistant to antibiotics. When you introduce antibiotics, natural selection happens. The ones that can resist the antibiotics stay alive. The rest of them die. So you've taken a population with two different varieties, killed off one of them. So that's not the creation of a new kind. But also when you actually study what makes them resistant to antibiotics, it's something that makes them the smallest part of the population because they are the weakest and less capable of surviving. The only reason they become the majority is because everything else is dead. Well, when you're the only survivor, you're the fittest, but that doesn't mean you're not broken.
Yeah.
Like if I go door to door and I shoot anyone in my neighborhood who isn't blind, that doesn't mean that being blind becomes a benefit. It just means that, well, you've survived. You haven't evolved into a better, more superior and more, indestructible type of human. It's just that the thing that killed everyone else, in this case, an insane terrorist act. I'm sorry I brought it up, but it's not the same thing as like I find Superman and the bullets won't penetrate him. It's just, it gets left alone. So
There's a difference between you becoming immune to something completely and everything else just happening to die because of that thing.
right. I mean, the short version is that the antibiotic resistant bacteria were already there, which again, they have to be, because if you introduce antibiotics to a population of bacteria, how long do they have to evolve a way to resist it? Not very long. Like if I throw a hand grenade into a room, how long do you have to evolve resistance to hand grenade explosions? You have 4 seconds. Like, it's not how it works. The resistance has to already be there when the environmental stressor shows up. That's just common sense. And again, that's what the CDC acknowledges, is that this is not bacteria changing and creating new genes so that they can resist antibiotics. It's that there are some malfunctioning bacteria that lack the ability to process whatever chemical needs to be processed by a normal healthy bacteria in order to actually shut down its reproduction or to end its life functions. So, those examples are not examples of beneficial mutations that create a new kind of thing. It's an example of something that has broken genes that, because of the mutation, it's beneficial in that one circumstance. But that becomes circumstantial, and again, doesn't do the job of turning worms into fish or fish into lizards or lizards into mammals or any other change in the evolutionary tree. So there are mutations, there are even beneficial mutations, but we've never observed the kind of beneficial mutation that adds information to a genome that would result in evolution. And a fun thing to find on the internet is if you Google Richard Dawkins being asked that question, when have we ever observed a beneficial mutation that adds information to a genome? He stares off in silence for a couple of seconds and then asks them to shut the camera off. And when they come back, he talks about a completely different topic. Like, this is the one thing you have to do to explain evolution, and you have nothing. And when he responded to that video later, he complained about it and basically just whined that creationists are rude, but never gave any examples. He never answered the question, which says that, like, if this guy who's the poster boy for evolutionary atheism has zero examples of beneficial mutations that add information to a genome, which is what evolution demands, then there probably aren't any. Or he might have brought one up. But maybe that's just my opinion. That's none of my business. Anyway, so in short, when you define evolution to mean what it has to mean, and then you look at the mechanisms we can actually observe, evolution fails the test of science. What I want to point out is that I have not said, if you first go to Genesis and then accept a literal reading of it, and then see that it conflicts with evolution, and you embrace Genesis, therefore evolution has to be false. Because that's the straw man that's thrown at me all the time. Actually, the debate I did last year, this guy kept insisting, well, you have to prove that God exists because that's your whole position. And I kept going, no, my position is that evolution fails the test of science. That at this point, I haven't said, in order to accept this conclusion I've come to, you have to be a theist, let alone be a Christian. An atheist can look at what I've said here and realize that I'm describing things accurately, and the logical conclusion is none of these mechanisms of evolution can do what evolution needs it to do. And the only one that hypothetically could is so improbable that it would take the blindest of hope and faith to think that it would, let alone that it has. So evolution fails the test of science. Therefore, we need a better explanation for where all life came from. That's when we come into the argument for design, the fact that every living cell is amazingly complex, full of information, full of machines, and absolutely bears the hallmark of intelligent design. We go, okay, well, who's that intelligent designer? And it has to be God. So there you go. Full circle back to why I think the Bible's true. How's that?
Honestly, that got me somewhat convinced now.
Excellent. You got any questions?
No, you pretty much got everything that I could ask in the moment right now. I actually have to do this stuff outside, so that's why you see all the snow behind me.
Well, it's
Actually,
lovely.
I don't even know if you can see me.
If I could have been outside for this, I would have, but I get no Wi-Fi out there. The snow's pretty. I appreciate it when it's not getting in the way of my driving. Well,
I did have. Oh, sorry. I did have one just because I appreciate you seem like you are a smart guy.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm trying not to. On top of the I don't have anything for the evolution. I did have one question that I really wanted to ask you specifically that I've been thinking about for a while that I wanted your opinion on.
Sure.
If you wouldn't mind me. Sorry, this isn't an evolution one. So
That's fine.
I was thinking, so you know the Big Bang Theory.
I do.
So the idea that everything was at one point pushed into a singular mass and then everything just kind of started expanding.
Yep.
What is a black hole?
A black hole, by most definitions, a black hole would simply be a place where the matter and density is so great that nothing can escape, including light. So yeah, singularity should be the most powerful black hole ever conceived, and yet somehow it expanded into the universe. So is that a contradiction? Yes, it absolutely is. But here's the thing where the Big Bang model rescues itself by appealing to the supernatural, is that when you get to the beginning of space-time, the laws of physics absolutely break down. And that's a phrase you'll actually hear Big Bang proponents use to describe it. That what they're acknowledging is everything that we consider science, all the laws of physics and chemistry do not apply to the beginning of the Big Bang model. And so you would say, well, according to what we know now, if you have all of the mass in the universe in this tiny little spot, gravity would cause it to stay that tiny little spot that it couldn't escape. And they'd go, well, the laws of physics just break down before then. And so there's other forces at play or other laws. So if you take the laws of nature and they don't apply, then what does apply is something above nature or outside of nature or supernatural. The Big Bang demands a supernatural explanation.
Yeah.
And again, like, okay, what's a supernatural explanation for space, time, matter, and energy? Well, you can't use something to explain itself. So the cause not only has to be supernatural, but spaceless, timeless, immaterial, transcendently powerful, and of course, capable of producing the fine-tuned laws of physics. So something tremendously intelligent. What do we know that's supernatural, tremendously intelligent, and also spaceless, timeless, and immaterial? That's the God of the Bible. So I don't accept the Big Bang. I think it fails because it fails the test of science. But if I did accept the Big Bang, I would still know that it proves that the God of the Bible is absolutely necessary to explain any observation we make. The universe itself exists, therefore the God of the Bible must exist. Thanks, Big Bang. I
Yeah,
love
that was
science.
one that's been, it's great. So that's one that's been sitting in my head for a while, and I had to ask somebody's opinion who was just going to say, well, just accept it. So
I'm happy to help.
yeah, I appreciate it. That's all I have. I appreciate you taking the time to go over that with me and answer the questions I had.
Certainly. Happy to. This has been good. It's been fun. This is the kind of stuff I've been teaching my middle school, high school classes. So I did get warmed up a little bit, but this also prepares me for what I need to teach over the next couple of weeks. So it's beneficial. So thanks for stopping by and asking good questions. I appreciate it. And if you have other questions, just let me know. Send me an email.
I will do that. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm going to take off. Thanks for talking to me. Have a good day. And remember, Jesus loves you.
Be well.